Good afternoon, traders. We're going to take a few minutes here and we're going to look at the first series of how do you work through the Tachyon scorecard for your NinjaTrader 8. I'm going to start off by going to a basic chart, and we're going to look into, go to File, New Chart. We're going to load up any kind of chart that we'd like in this particular menu. You'll probably have many more than I do. For the sake of what we're going to do here today, we're going to start with the ES. So I'm just going to load up an ES 1 minute chart with 30 days of data on it, so that we can get something out that we can have a look at. All right, so now we have a plain Jane chart with 30 days of data for an ES on our NinjaTrader 8. Now we're going to come down to our Indicators tab, and we're going to load our Tachyon scorecard. So we're going to load our Tachyon. If I can click on the button here. Why is it not working? Interesting. There we go. So we're going to come down to our Tachyon Time Warp scorecard. Okay, so I have the Time Warp SE version here, and double click on it. You will see in the top right hand side that it shows up as SE. So the current release on this at the time of this recording is 2018 11.7 SE. So if you have a scorecard edition, that's where you will go for that. So you should, that's how you can confirm you do have it. First thing we're going to do, we're going to scroll down to the bottom and we're going to turn on the scorecard. Now, scorecard enabled, you're going to see there's an area down here in the general scorecard properties, and we're going to click on scorecard. Once we have enabled our scorecard, we can now go through and we can start analyzing our individual signals. So just by clicking that on, I'm going to go ahead and hit apply on my chart. And when I hit apply, you'll see in the upper left hand corner, I'm on a 1 minute chart. I'm actually going to change that to a 5 because it's going to calculate much quicker for the purpose of our demonstration here today. You can use it on all the way down to a 30-second chart. But again, each chart does take a little bit of time to load. So let's get this one loaded up, and as soon as it comes up here, we're going to change it over to 5 minute, which will load way faster, more than 5 times faster. All right, so let's just go ahead and drop it down for now. We can see there are scores on the different patterns. They're all coming out okay with the standard setting, but again, just for the purposes of our demonstration, I'm going to change this to a 5, just so that I have, there we go, just so it loads much quicker. 1 minute and 30 seconds take the longest to load. So if it takes a minute, don't get overly freaked out. Once it's loaded, it takes almost no resources to operate, but it does take a minute to pull all that data in. So now that we've got that on our chart and our scorecard is turned on, we should be able to see those properties in the lower left-hand corner. Now we're going to take a look at what are these things telling us. The scorecard is enabled, and if you want to change the location of your printout, you can simply come up here to the scorecard location. Right now I have it set to bottom left. You could set it to any of the locations that you've got identified here. If you want to put it on the bottom right, which will pull it down here, simply move it to the bottom right, and when it comes back on, now it's over here. So again, you can move the text around to different places. You can also change the size of the text. If it's too small, if you want to see it a little bigger, you can make it a 15 or so. We'll make it a 15, just it'll come out a little larger. Again, makes it a little bit easier for us to see, and you can also change the color. So if you're using a white background, you'd simply come through and you would change your font color to something else, or your font area color. So if you want white, but if you want black around it, again, we give you the ability to do that. If it's covering up something else, or if you got it in a way and you want to change the opacity so it's kind of a background thing, then you can simply choose right there, and you can change the opacity of it as well. So a couple of basic things to get out of the way. When you're looking at your scorecard, okay, so now our basics are, we're looking at the scorecard and we have it turned on. Now let's go up to the top of the chart and see what it's actually measuring. The scorecard is going to start off by measuring each and every pattern that shows up on our chart. I'm going to turn my patterns on for just a moment. So signal dots, I had mine defaulted to signal dots only. Okay, so now my patterns are showing. So you should have something that looks like this. I think I have default settings on this chart, I think. Let me look and make sure. Pretty much, yeah. So I pretty much got default settings on here. So using my default settings, what the scorecard is measuring, the scorecard is looking across the course of the chart, and it's asking the question, when there is a pattern 1 is identified here. When there is a pattern 1, does the market go up from the dot, close of the bar at the dot? Does the market go up into the sell dot or into the next pattern before it crosses over the physical location of the dot on the chart. Okay, so that's what it's done. So in this particular case, this would be a scored negative. So this would be what we would consider to be a failed signal with our current settings. Now, this can change. We can come through and let's see what happens when we give this a little bit more room. So some of you may be saying, well, it didn't close below. It is not required to close on the other side of the dot. The current scorecard method, as of the time of this recording, it is simply looking for a penetration or a puncture of the dot. If the dot is punctured, the scorecard counts it as a failure. Now, let's go through and look at a few things. We're seeing that we have our dot locations and all that stuff looks happy. Off this pattern 4 that we saw earlier, this one was also a failed signal. When you have your scorecard turned on, a pattern 4 failure is when the market pierces the other side. So a pattern 4 is a reversal. And we're going to go through and look at your pattern book. So a pattern 4 should have pulled back up. And in this particular case, when the pattern 4 hit the equal dot distance on the other side, then that signal became a failure. Okay, so again, that's a trend continuation move at that point. So again, patterns are important because the scorecard is literally measuring the patterns as they are written out and as they are programmed in the pattern book. If you want to see a scorecard where there are no patterns, if you don't want the patterns, you just want the buy and sell dots, scroll back to your chart and roll down to the scorecard general properties, and we're now going to select pattern neutral. When we select the pattern neutral, go ahead and hit OK. So by selecting pattern neutral and we hit OK, you will now see that there are only 2 types of signals on the chart. There are buy dots and there are sell dots. And a lot of you, this will be the type of preference that you have. Instead of watching and learning your patterns, a lot of you just want to say, well, show me the sells and show me the buys. Great. That's what you got. So there's the buys and the sells. Now, we're going to leave it on here for just a moment because I think everybody has a gist of there is a difference of patterns versus buy dots and sell dots. Okay, again, now we are not looking at any 4s, 5s, 6s, or 7s. Everything on here is strictly a buy or a sell. And we're measuring how frequently, not only how frequently, we are measuring how consistently the market is reacting around each of those buys and sells. We're going to take a minute and let's look at the output itself. I'm going to make it even bigger so that we can see it better. And we've made it font size. Let's go to the font size of 20. So we're going to make it even bigger so we can look at these numbers. The numbers that it's actually telling us, so we're now in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. In the bottom right-hand corner, it tells us that we have buy dots and sell dots. And again, all this information would be the same if you have all the patterns turned on. Okay, with all the patterns on, you would just have more fields of information. Across this particular chart, there are 302 buy dots currently showing on the chart. We could go through and count them manually, but on this 5-minute chart at 30 days of data, there are 302 dots. Okay, so that's what the second number tells us. The second number there is the total number of signals that the indicator is seeing. The first number is the number of signals that have worked out. In other words, that's the number of signals where a buy dot here moved into a sell dot here before it crossed over the dot value or the dot price. So that would be a winning or a positive signal. So out of 302 of those, there have been 142 at this point that have successfully gone from a buy to a sell before it crossed over the course of the dot. There have been 302 sell dots on this chart at the moment, and 154 of those, or 50.199%, 154 of them, of the sell dots have moved lower into the buy dot before they crossed over the sell dot, such as like we would have here. So here we had a sell time, sell dot, and the market was moving down. Unfortunately, this one did come all the way back up, and we had that dumb little spike, and the spike would have taken it out. So this was considered, although the underlying, obviously everything moved down, with this one candle coming out, the scorecard counted that as a losing or as a negative signal because this did get penetrated. Okay, so again, when that dot got penetrated, scorecard said, nope, we're done. It's all over. So again, it takes no bias. There's no bias at all generated here. So that's what our scorecard's telling us. Now, how do we tweak these numbers? Well, we can tweak these numbers a myriad of different ways. If you're fairly new to backtesting, there are many, or if you're fairly new to the indicator set, there are a lot of things that you can do on this indicator set that will allow you to change those numbers. One of the most common things is let's ask the question. We always want to ask the question of our indicator. Going back down to the scorecard section for a moment, what happens if we apply a trend filter? So we have that ability here. So we could turn on or off a trend filtration. If I turn on the trend filtration, let's click the button. If I turn on trend filtration, then if we look just above it in the moving average section, here, we will see that there's a place for EMA 120, how we want it shown. The EMA is already on the chart, but now the scorecard will utilize the EMA as its trend filter. Simply means if the market price is above the trend filter, then it would only count the buy signals. If the market price is below the moving average, it would only count the sell signals. So without changing anything else, let's see how that affects our score. So just by adding a 120 period EMA to our score, let's see how that affects the overall number. Earlier, we had 300 and some odd dots. I don't remember the number, but we had 300 and some odd dots. And out of that 300, we were sitting at about 45% of them. So we're successful. Now we're at 46% of the buy dots above the moving average. We only have 172. That means the rest of those buy dots came in below the moving average. Okay, so by applying that moving average to them, it applies that filter, if you would. So there's a lot less signals on the chart. Okay, so instead of 300, there's only 170. We can now come through and we can choose a different kind of EMA. And we can also choose the value. So if we want to look at instead of an EMA, if we wanted to look at, let's say we wanted to look at a whole moving average, an HMA, and maybe we want to look at we'll put a 21 period. So there's no real right or wrong answer here. It's just a matter of research. So if we apply a 21 period whole moving average to our chart, does it change how the signals would form by using trend filtration? Absolutely it does. So now we can see that we only have 147 that are above the moving average, and it comes in at 50.7% or 51. So by changing the moving average, if we're using our moving average for our trend filtration, by changing that moving average, it can output or change our scores. Now again, remember, we're simply scoring the dot itself. We're not saying anything yet about profits and targets and that sort of thing. We're only scoring the actual raw signals on the chart. The other thing that will change our score dramatically, and we're going to come back here and look at this section again, if we move to the top, come to the top of our list, if we look in our signal generator section, so now we're looking under signal generator. Here we are in the signal generation area. This is where the signal starts to come from. Okay, so we're generating signals based off of our swing indicator. If we change our swing indicator from a swing strength of 5 to a swing strength of 7, as an example, we can see how does that score out. Do the larger swings work better, or do they work more negatively? So again, we can change and we can tweak that number, and that number will change significantly. We can go all the way down to a 3 or a 1 if we wanted a lot more signals on the chart. And by changing the number, again, it will change the frequency of the signal, and it will change how the market reacts, because we're looking at different information historically. We can also change to a zigzag. If you're going to use the zigzag indicator, much like you will see in the other videos on just the basic time warp, make sure you understand what the point deviation values are. If you're using a point system, okay, points are literally, I'm on the ES market, so 0.5 point, that's going to be a lot of signals. So that's every 2 ticks on a 5-minute chart. It's going to be like 100 million signals, because again, it's very, very fine. I would probably, on this 5-minute chart, I would probably look for something along the range of, I want to see 5-point swings. So every time there's a 5-point swing on the ES, it would show us a swing value and a signal generated based off of that. Okay, so again, this is every time the market made a 5-point move historically. Some of you would use that, some of you wouldn't. If you're using percent instead of points, just remember that it's looking at the overall percent of the price of the instrument. So if you're looking at 5%, if we left it here, 5% of 2,747, well, 5% of that is a big number. So you may not be looking for, that would be 30 point moves. So that would give you a swing of 30 point moves. So that would be quite a few. You wouldn't see nearly as many. So again, that's how that works. So make sure that you realize that before you go to apply it. Most of you are going to stick with a swing indicator. Swing indicator, again, is fairly simple, and you can apply one to your chart to see approximately where they're coming in. The other thing that we can do under the signal generator section, I'm going to change this back to a 5. Under the signal generator section, we can choose an alternate data series or a secondary data series. Under our secondary data series, now we're looking for a different instrument or a different time frame. In this particular case, we have the ability, I could leave it on ES 1218. It will come up there by default. And instead of a minute, or a minute value of 1, I can change it to a minute value of, let's say, 10 for kicks and giggles. So we can apply a 10-minute signal to our 5-minute chart. And when we do this thing, we can score it down at the bottom. So we can say, does the 10-minute signal give any more validity than the 5-minute signal? And in this case, with no other settings, it doesn't. We can also change to different instruments. If you change to a different instrument, you will need to manually type it in. In this case, I'm going to choose a CL. Just for the purpose of example, we're going to choose a CL 0118. So this crude 0118, I have already been running crude in the background on a different market or on my other workspaces, so I don't have to load a chart. If you've never loaded a crude chart before, you will need to load a crude chart. It does not have the indicator on it. You just have to pull in a crude 1-minute chart with 30 or 40 days of data, nothing on it. It just has to pull the data in so that this thing can see it, and then it should take right off. So if I want to come to crude, I can apply a crude 5-minute value, and again, now we look at crude 5-minute signals and see how they affect the ES 5-minute market. So we can turn those two on, and it did not give me a signal yet. Why did it not give me a signal? Because it freaked out somewhere. So something didn't go quite the way that I thought it should. Let's see if that'll come back up now. Interesting. Okay, give me a second, guys. It should have pulled it right up in there. Did I type the wrong instrument? I think we are on the 0180. Not 0118, my fault. 0119. So my apologies. We're on the 0119 contract right now. That's going to make a difference. There we go. So again, it has to be typed in correctly. You've just seen what happens when it's not typed in correctly. So I can now come through and I can look and I can analyze how efficient are my crude 5-minute signals on my ES 5-minute chart. I could do the same thing with a crude 5-minute on a 1-minute ES chart. Okay, we can also choose for any other of the data series in this box. So if we wanted to see how efficient a range bar is, or a tick bar, for instance. So if I'm looking at a tick bar, I can apply a crude, let's say 500 tick bar, and we can put a 500 tick signal on the crude onto this ES chart. And again, the combinations here are pretty much endless. So you can use a lot of different combinations. Now, when you're using tick, when you're using range, when you're using volume, when you're using Renko, all of those other bar types will take a little bit more processing power because, again, there's a lot more digging that the indicator has to do. So while it's calculating, we can see in the upper left-hand corner, it's calculating all of the crude 500 tick signals or 500 tick bars and where the timing signals would have fallen based on a 5 swing, and it's going to apply those times forward onto our ES chart when it finally comes back up. So I probably should have chosen a 1500 or something of that nature, and that probably would have come up a little cleaner. So give it just a second here. Let's see if it's going to come back. There we go. It's going to be a lot of signals. I didn't think it through, but it is going to be a lot of signals. So as soon as it comes back up, we'll get it back off of there. Again, to enable this entire section, you do have to turn on your secondary data series. There's all those crude signals. And again, based on the information you can see, it's a lot of signals. So again, Just have to be aware of what it is. It did crunch all the numbers, but it does take a little bit longer. So if you're going to use a secondary data series, you do have to turn it on. And we can see that there are 311 signals above the moving average. Remember, we do still have our moving average turned on down here and our trend filtration, and we're still just looking at the pattern neutrals. So when we're looking at those things, these are continuing to work. So all these things combined together. I'm going to turn this back off, and we're going to go back and look at the next segment down. So we've looked at a signal generator. These are where the signals are coming from, and this is the indicator that's generating them, and the instrument that's generating the actual signals under the signal generator. Now we're going to go to signal origination. So we got two different things: what generates the signals and where they originate from. So there's a tool that will generate the signal. The origination is, where did the tool come from? Where did the tool get its information? And this is going to be a section that a lot of you are going to spend an extreme amount of time. We have the ability, just like with all the dot segments, anything that you apply here goes through and it looks and it tells the indicator. It will either add signals or take signals away. It will improve them. It will average more in. It will take some away. We can now go through and we can test the efficacy of each of these signals by simply applying, again, I added a third reference type. So by adding a third reference type, we can see that the buy dots and the sell dots, 57%, 54%, by giving it one more day in our averaging. So instead of just looking back 7 and 14 days, 7, 14, and 21, I gave it a little bit more time in there, and it improved some of our outputs. Again, these are things that you can play with. There is no right or wrong answer in any of these settings. These are simply settings that each individual person in each individual market will tailor themselves to. You can also do this on any chart and any time frame, by the way. So we're choosing a 5-minute chart just for the purposes of our example here. We have had very good success in other customers with things like 360-second charts and 240-second charts. So you can go all the way down into the second basis. We have customers that run 30-second charts. Tick charts, Renko charts, any chart that's in your book can operate on the time warp and with the scorecard. You can also choose whether or not trading days ago or calendar days. Now the default setting is always calendar days. If you're using trading days, remember that when you have it set to trading days, you can now use any segment, and trading days omits weekends. So trading days does not count Saturday or Sunday. Those are not official trading days. Trading days are Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So again, when we're looking at trading days, these are the 5 days of the week. When we're only looking at trading days, it will omit the weekend. So instead of looking back 7 calendar days, which would be a Thursday to a Thursday in this case, we would be looking back a Thursday. We would be looking back 7 days, which would put us Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday, and to take us into last Wednesday. Okay, so we would omit the weekend out of that, and we would add, actually this would take us back to last Tuesday instead of last Thursday. So again, just realize what it's telling us. But we can test, are those signals viable? Do those signals make any difference? If we just look back the same number of days, but look back trading days instead of calendar days, we can see, does it benefit us or does it not? Again, you can make that decision for yourself based on what your outputs and what your scores are and the way that you're going to use it. Another thing that you're going to want to look at, and this is going to be a big one, another thing that you're going to want to look at that makes a fairly significant difference in your outputs or in your scores is the dot separation, the dot offset. The dot offset, remember, I've got mine set to 5 currently. So my dot offset is the distance from the lowest part of the candle to the dot. So that would be the distance from here to here. So the distance from the lowest part of the candle to here. So that's our dot offset. The lowest part of the bar to the actual dot. Now, why is that important? That is important because that's what this market and that's what all the time warp scoring is doing. It's actually scoring and is using that value in our scores. So it's not saying, it's not looking at it and telling you where the close of the bar is. Close of the bar is not what it's looking at. It's looking at the lowest part of the bar. So from the lowest part of the bar to the dot is how it scores. So the further the dot moves away from the bar, or in reality, the more room that you decide to give the market, well, the more it can change your score. In this case, if I went from a dot offset of 5 to a big number, let's use what we would consider to be an outrageous number, which would probably be somewhere around an 8 on the ES market. That would be around a 2-point gap. For me, that's a pretty big number, but let's watch and see what it does to our scores. If we're looking at our actual scores, I'm going to load another tool here for a second that's just going to record this for us. So we've got this number. I'm going to pull it back over, and let's hit apply, and let's look at the difference. By giving the market 3 more ticks of movement, do we see any difference in the score output? The yellow box is telling us what happens if we have a 5-tick offset. If we give it a little bit more room, well, we can see that the scores go up quite dramatically. The number of dots stays the same. There's still 174 buy dots and 188 sell dots. Those are not going to change. What will change is the number of winning dots or the number of losing dots and what percentage those are to the overall totals. So again, scorecard can be dramatically changed by increasing or decreasing the timestamp or the dot offset. Okay, so something you want to keep in mind. Okay, so watch for the dot offset, and your dot offset will make a fairly significant difference, or can. You would want to tweak this or change this on an instrument by instrument basis, and if you're like many of us, we kind of use that area for a absolute stop. So if you're going to use that for your reference, again, just bear in mind that it stops may be larger than 8 ticks. That would be the distance from the candle lowest point to the actual dot. Okay, so again, that is not the close of the bar, it's the lowest point or the highest point of the bar. The other thing you can apply here is a lot of people ask, well, do my signals change? Absolutely. As the market morphs and changes, so might your signals. You can actually go through and test, well, what happens if I observe a chart where if I look across the morning and it looks like most of my signals were a minute or two early or a bar early? You can now go through and test, and you can shift to fit the market. Now, you can't shift an individual signal, but you could shift the whole bunch of them. This also can be scored. You can ask the question, well, if I change this number, does it change my scores? So by going to a -1 and turning on the signal shifting, I can now customize my chart and say, all right, does it make a difference if I move forward just a little bit? And in this case, yes. So the dots get the signals get a little cleaner. So again, some markets, some time frames may lend themselves to a dot offset or a dot shift. You do have to turn that on. It is a standard function in any time warp program. Okay, but if you turn it on, just remember you've moved all of your signals globally across the board 1 tick forward. If you want to retard them 1 tick or move them 1 tick further out, simply take away the minus. Again, it does tell you here how to work that on the scorecard. So those are some things, and those are the most common settings that you're going to find. We're going to move back down here just a little bit, and we're going to have one more look at just the scorecard properties. When you're looking at scorecard properties, there are 2 methods of scoring. Okay, so we've talked about what you see in the scores. We've talked about some rough ways to set the scores, and each of the things that we've done here, we've been looking at what we call a dot-to-dot reference. And a dot-to-dot reference is simply where we are looking for the movement from one dot to the next dot. You also have the ability to engage a target and a stop method. If you engage a target and a stop method, we can now units of measure. Are we going to use ticks, or are we going to use an average true range? Okay, if we use an average true range, we have to tell the indicator what that average true range is. In this case, we have it defaulted to 7, which means it would look back 7 bars all the time. You could use as little as 1. So you could use 1 bar ATR if you want to see a really quick one, or you could go 14 or 20 if you want to see longer moves of the market. If we're using ticks, and if we choose our targets and stops, then we would come to the general scorecard properties, and there's a lot more settings in here. We just have to open them up. We can now come through, we can choose time and date filters. If you only are interested in testing to see what the market does during the times that you're wanting to trade, we can turn on time filters. When we turn on time filters, you're going to see I have mine set 8:30 to 12 o'clock. Now I can ask the indicator right now, I can say, well, you know what? let's go through and let's now find out how well, we'll turn this back off for a second. I can now come through and I can say, how well does my setting here, whatever my setting is, how well does it do only from this time of day? Only from 8:30 to 12 o'clock. And we can see. Now I'm measuring the same settings. I didn't change anything on the chart, but from 8:30 in the morning to 12 o'clock, how well do my signals perform? And again, it now tells me that I have a lot less trades, that I don't have nearly as many signals between 8:30 and 12 o'clock. I only have 24 that occurred above the moving average during that time frame, and 58.33% of them worked out well. Below the moving average, I had 28 signals, and 12 out of the 28 worked out well. Again, each of these things can be modified or tested. Every setting that I change across the top will obviously change the setting on the score. I can also engage date filters. So if I'm looking back 30 days of data on this chart, and if I'm chart is set at 30 or 40 or 60 days, and let's say I only want to look back the last 5. So I know I've got it set at 60, but I don't want to measure all 60 days. I just want to see, what has the market been doing the last few days? I can come through, I can choose my date today, and today is, what is today? December 11th, 11/29. So today is 11/29. I can look back and say, how efficient have my signals been since Monday? So we're on Thursday. How efficient have they been since Monday? So I can say, okay, I want to see what my settings were doing Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this week. So if I turn my time bars back off, I'm just measuring now. It's going to be still printed all the way across the chart, but the scorecard is now only going to measure the last couple of days. And it's now going to score. And it's going to tell me, in the last 3 days, 71% of my signals have been good. So in the last 3 days only, looking all day long, I've had 32 buy dots, and I've had 39 sell dots above and below the moving average. 71% of them have been good. Now, if I want to come through and I can put on my time filter, oops, let's get back in here again. Now I can say, well, that's great. Now I want to apply my time filter again for just the last 3 days. So again, now these numbers are going to be smaller because I'm filtering things out. So I can see that over the last 3 days, I've only had 4 buy dots that were above the moving average, and 75% of them worked. So again, the information is there. Now I can engage the market based on what is the market doing right now versus what has it been doing on average over the last 6 or 8 weeks. Maybe that's the way you want to use it. It's up to your discretion. So that's what our time and date filters will do for us. Let's go back just a little bit, and we're going to click on General Scorecard Properties again. So now we're going to go back to that dot-to-dot reference. Now if we want to choose our targets and stops, when I choose targets and stops, now I'm going to come to my patterns 1 and 2. Using pattern 1 and 2, these are the only patterns that are required for the pattern neutral. So if I'm in pattern neutral, the only thing I have to worry about is my pattern 1 and pattern 2. If I want to ask the question of the market, well, if I want to measure the market now by how many ticks it's been moving and by a risk in place, I can now use a risk versus reward. Now we can come through and let's say I'm looking for a 12 tick targets, and let's say I'm willing to give it 10 tick stops. Not such an unreasonable thing off of each signal. So now this will be measured off the close of the bar, not the highest or lowest bar, but targets and stops are based off of the close of the bar at the time of the signal. Now we can ask the question, is this a reasonable thing for us to ask in this market? Well, 43% of the time, out of the last 174 signals across the board, because again, we took our other patterns or our other stuff away. So we took our other time and date filters away. So if we look at every signal across the board, 43% of them moved 12 ticks before it moved 10 ticks. Okay. So again, now we can come back and we can apply any date filters we wanted to reestablish. We could put our date filters back on there if we wanted. We could say, okay, well, how many of them have worked? How many of them have done well? Well, 56%, 18 out of 32 in just the last few days have moved up. Well, that means we probably would have been profitable because 56% of the time, and again, our risk to reward was a 1.2. So that means we would have made some cash there. Selling at the sell dots, again, maybe not as much. So that's what we can measure. So these are things that we have the ability to measure. So that's our scorecard. So when you first get your scorecard, you're going to find that everything's turned off. If you want to turn it on, the first thing you will need to do is come down to the scorecard enabled section. Turn your scorecard on. Once you turn your scorecard on, then you can choose. It will be decided by default ... Once your scorecard is turned on, then you can choose where you want to see the outputs, how big you want to see the outputs, and now you can start scoring the chart that you are looking at. Remember, all of your settings at the top are applicable. So all of the settings up here make a difference. So as you're going continually, you can constantly monitor and measure and see how your progress is doing and how the signals are doing on a real-time basis, or you can turn them back off. So again, that is something that you can apply in a real time and watch it as you go. Scorecard, NinjaTrader 8. Pay attention, watch for what it tells you, and enjoy the use of your new tool.